I'm your host, sabrinasalvati. I'm your host, sabrinasalvati. I'm your host, sabrinasalvati. All right. Happy Thursday. Welcome to Sabby Sabs podcast. I'm your host, Sabrina Salvati. I am very excited about my special guest today. Her name is Clare Daly. She is a member of the European Parliament, and she is also a member of Independence for Change, which is part of the left in the European Parliament. Clare, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks very much for having me, Sabrina. Pleasure is all mine.
So, Clare, I've been covering the strikes that are happening in the UK. I've been very impressed and excited, and at the same time, a little bit frustrated because as an American living in the United States, it is very difficult as an organizer to get even 50 people to show up to a protest. It has been difficult to try to get people to organize across different industries to go on strike. So I'm not sure if you heard about this, but the railroad workers in the US, they were thinking about going on strike. The Congress came in and prevented that from happening. And so they're back to square one. So I'm curious, when I look at countries like France, when I look at the UK, how is it that you're able to get thousands of people out in the streets to push back against the establishment and to push back against these corporations and corporate interests? And what do you think we could be doing differently here in the US?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's so much in that question. I mean, I'm from Ireland and I asked the same questions as you. And before I was in the Parliament, I was an airport worker and a shop steward in my job. And workers in our company always used to say, oh, I wish we could be more like the French, that we could shut down airports and all the rest of it. So I think in every country, there's a sort of a tendency to think that far away hills are green. So when we look at the situation in France at the moment, and we were in the European Parliament last week, we were in Strasbourg, I'm in Brussels in Belgium now, but the Parliament couldn't return home on Thursday because all of the country was shut down in terms of transport because of workers objecting to the changes in the pension scheme. So that was a pretty radical gesture. As someone from Ireland, obviously being a neighbour of the situation in the UK, we've been really impressed with the way the rail workers in particular have handled the strike. So why is it like that? I mean, I suppose the first thing is to say that the reason why workers in these countries are beginning to get off their knees is in response to the horrible austerity and cutbacks in their living conditions which are being imposed. So it's probably not a good thing in some ways. It's because the government are attacking gains in social provisions which were there for years, for example, in terms of the French pension situation. I think in Britain it's a little bit different. I think after years of, I suppose, COVID being used as an excuse to batter workers, people have said enough. And they've been fortunate to have a leadership, which is important, a radical militant leadership who've been able to tap in to the attacks and draw out the generalized lessons that are there. So if you take Mick Lynch and the Rail Workers Union, he's become a sort of a poster boy of being absolutely brazen in defense of workers' rights. So when the political establishment are going to say, oh, we can't afford this, or oh, you're inconveniencing other workers who are trying to get to work because you're going on strike, he's able to make the link and say, this is a strike for all workers. We don't want to stop people going for work or to make the lives of other workers more difficult. But we're not doing that. Their cause is the same as our cause. We're standing up for our members who've been battered and who've suffered a pay reduction really over the course of the past number of years, while the profits of the rail companies and the big sectors, we see it obviously across the energy sectors, are booming. So workers' conditions are going backwards while the profits of the big corporations are increasing. And that those two issues are linked. And I think it's really that simple that they've been able to say, and people have had enough. So when you have a confident leadership who've been bold and capable of answering the establishment's lies and capable of answering the inevitable tactics of divide and rule, that people will respond to that. And that's always been my experience, that when you explain to workers, when you're bold and lead to the front, and if people believe that they're involved in an action that's purposeful, well, then they'll go out, because nobody's going to give up a day's wages or go on strike or take that step. Nobody wants to be doing that. They'll only do it if it's A, they've no choice, or B, that they think it's a strategy that's going to improve the situation. So that probably doesn't really answer the question, but I think it's the same the world over, you know?
Well, I think it was interesting what you mentioned about the leadership. And I think that's a piece that we're missing here in the United States. We have progressives that are in Congress that said that they were going to push back against the Democrat establishment, but they have not done that. And they've been there for a couple of years now. We have actually watched them go along with corporate Democrats so that they can get certain committee seats and assignments. So I think that's a big part of it. I have a friend that lives in the UK, and he was actually warning me a couple of months ago that he wasn't sure if they were going to be able to pay for heat for the winter. And then later on, I saw that there were these facilities in the UK called warm banks where residents can go to get heat. How else has inflation affected people in the UK? Because I did hear that inflation is I think the highest in the UK when you compare it around the world right now. How else have people been affected?
Well, I think that has been a big problem. And obviously the UK left the European Union, so I don't know a huge amount about what's going on there in the ground. We're just their nearest neighbours. We wouldn't necessarily experience the same things, but I mean, I think it's a similar process right across Europe, like the energy crisis in particular, and Europe from being the little best sort of lackeys of following the US in relation to the war in Ukraine and so on, were very upset when they found out that Biden's Inflation Reduction Act and protectionism in America has led to a situation whereby Europeans are being charged 4 times the amount for energy that US companies are being charged. So they kind of said their like-minded partner is kind of screwing them, and they don't like that. So look, living conditions are difficult across Europe, and many, many citizens were faced with the choice of either heating or eating this winter, in part because of the profiteering of the big corporations over the energy crisis, and in part because Europe has shot itself in the foot by imposing massive sanctions against Russia, who was its biggest supplier of gas, and they've substituted that supply for much more expensive LNG from the US and from other quarters as well. So that's been a kind of a nightmare. And it's interesting, the point you made about leadership and that, because I think one of the things that was different, say, in the UK, and as I say, they've left the EU, but the union standing up and sort of saying enough is enough was a barometer, because the political establishment in the UK, like what you've mentioned in terms of the US, and people, you know, the Labour Party in Britain, for example, stood not on the side of the workers, who they would traditionally say we're the party of workers. And looking from the outside, it seems that obviously Biden did that as well. They bring in this appalling law to stop workers striking, and people who were in the US political positions sort of pretended that that was okay, or they're there as workers' representatives and didn't call that out. I mean, that's utterly shocking. And that has to be a break on the movement, because that then makes workers feel demoralized. So what is the point in putting people into elected positions to challenge the system, and then they're dignified with that privilege of being able to have a platform? And that's all elected positions are, as far as I'm concerned. They're a platform to organize from. So if you're somebody who pretends to be a workers' representative, you've been given that privilege. Well, you don't have it forever, so you might as well use it. And thinking that you're holding on to it for a few crumbs is good enough, and justifying that, oh, well, I have to kind of protect myself and stay here because then it'll be better. I'll get you a few crumbs here. Not good enough. And time has shown that again and again, that workers' parties and workers' representatives who go into power and say, but I'm here, I'm getting you a few crumbs, that'll be enough. It'll always collide. So it's probably the situation your friends in the UK. The system won't keep giving the crumbs, and it's the ordinary people who pay for it. So you can try and delay the fight if you want, but ultimately people have to organise. And that's why one of the examples in the UK at the moment is kind of outside the trade union movement and outside the political system, but feeding into it. And that's the kind of enough is enough campaign, whereby you have a campaign demanding a real pay rise, a cut in energy bills, an end to food poverty, decent homes, and nationalisation of certain industries. And it's not been led by political parties. Actually, political parties and trade unions are being asked to subscribe and support that call. And that call is being used to put pressure on the political establishment. And it strikes me that something like that might be a good idea in the US as well. It's certainly a good idea across the rest of Europe for sure.
You have been very vocal. I've seen many videos of you on Twitter standing up against this war in Russia and Ukraine. I'm curious, some of our members that we have of Congress have been somewhat timid or afraid to push back and voice how they feel about being anti-war. If they're supposed to be anti-war, we've seen them cower to Democrat leadership. And I'm curious, why is it for someone like you don't seem to have that fear to be vocal about this conflict and express exactly like how you feel? That one of the things you mentioned recently was that there needs to be some type of call for peace. We're not hearing that from our congressmen and women in the United States. Why is it that you're not afraid to be vocal about those things?
Well, I think there's two things about that question. I think your representatives aren't unique in that. I mean, we get this all the time. Like there are over 700 members in the European Parliament, for example, and in the first resolution on the war, there were 13 of us who voted against it. So we're kind of in a small minority here as well. So it would be wrong to think that Europe is full of all these people standing up against the war. It certainly isn't. The political establishment in Europe is completely out of step with the hearts and minds of its citizens. And that's a huge political problem across both sides of the Atlantic, that the people in power are actually divorced from the ideas and the lived experience of most people. And that's for us a huge example in relation to the war. Like, I'm from Ireland, it's a very small country in Europe, but we get contacted by people every single day from other countries across Europe saying, why are you the only ones kind of saying this? So, I mean, that's a negative in some ways. I suppose why you could say one of the reasons why we are is that I'm not a member of a political party. And people think if you have to be in a political party to have an ideology. But that's just utter nonsense. You know, I obviously have an ideology. I'm a left-wing person. I would say I'm a socialist. But I don't have to be in a party. I was in a party for years. I don't feel I need to be in a party to stand by that. And sometimes when people are in parties, the party is used to batter them into line. And they're afraid to stand against the party hierarchy because they're the people who they think get them elected. So they're serving the party rather than the people who the party is supposed to be serving. It puts that layer in there. But look, on the other side, I mean, the propaganda around this war and the intimidation of anti-war activists, of ordinary people, even of European business interests whose interests are not even being served by this war, but even European capitalism has been cowed into shutting up and not speaking out against this war. Such is the scale of the propaganda that's around it. I have never in my life seen anything like it. And I've been involved in politics for a very long time. And we have been subjected to the most appalling vitriol. And even now, people at home would say to us, oh my God, your reputation has been literally jumped on in the media, that we have been described as Putin puppets, as sort of almost been responsible for killing people in Ukraine, when we're the people who have the record of being anti-war, and the people given out to us are the people who championed and facilitated US imperialism in its wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. They're people who never say, let's arm the Palestinians against Israel, or say, let's go and give the people of Yemen some weapons to fight the Saudis. They never say that. But suddenly now, giving weapons to Ukraine is a way of helping the people of Ukraine. What utter nonsense. They are the people who are the cannon fodder of this war. And unfortunately, their leader Zelensky seems to be, I don't know, I'm seriously thinking now that this man is getting about a cent for every piece of ammunition that's thrown into that country, because it is beyond any military industrial complex's fanfare or marketplace. The amount of weapons that are going into that country, the amount of it that's ending up for sale on the black market in Europe, it's just scandalous. The only people winning out of this are the military industrial complex, yet society and the media are the biggest people responsible in this, are battering people into submission, that people are afraid to talk about peace, because if you do, you're going to be labeled as a Putin puppet, you're going to be accused of murdering people in Ukraine, and people are afraid, and people kind of say, whew, don't need that hassle. And we get it every single day from people in every European country saying, really like what you're saying, we agree, my work colleagues agree, but we're afraid to speak out, because when we do, we just get kind of jumped on. And that's some scary spectacle. But that, it comes back to the media for sure. They are bought and paid for, and they are just puppets of the political establishment. And sadly, the European establishment has sold itself. As I say, I actually think, and I think many sections of European capitalism realizes that they too have shot themselves and have lost money, but they're afraid to speak up as well. It's mental, and they've spent the knee to US imperialism and to NATO. And as I say, it's the big wigs who probably, no US president can really get elected without bringing the big corporations with him. They're the ones who pay for him, so he who pays the piper, or plays the tune, and that's what it is. And most of the money, which should be going to US citizens for welfare, for building houses and all of that, it's not even going to Ukraine, the billions. They say it is. It's not leaving the US, but it's not going into the pockets of US workers. It's going into the pockets of the big military companies, while people in the US would far benefit from those billions being spent on real things to improve your living standards rather than killing people. Because this idea that the weapons are defending people in Ukraine, did you ever hear anything as stupid? How are they? When weapons are there for one thing only, that's to kill people. And they may say, well, sure, look, but they're only killing Russians. They're killing poor Russians. But do they honestly think that by killing Russians, that Russia is going to say, oh God, we're sorry about that now. We'll give up that war now and we won't do anything else? No, they won't. They will ratchet it up even further. And it's criminally negligent that the international community is not organising now, as we approach the first anniversary of this devastating war, to say, please, it has to stop. The implications across the globe, the global south, the disruption of the grain trade, all of it, but international bullying, because this is a NATO proxy war, and it is against Russia. And Russia are responsible. They shouldn't have crossed the line, but the idea that they weren't provoked doesn't justify it. But they were provoked by NATO coming up near their boundaries. They shouldn't have fallen for it, but they did. But NATO caused this, and now what they're doing is making sure it keeps going, and it's unreal.
Well said. So recently, Germany, and this really kind of hurt my heart because I grew up in Germany. Germany just announced that they are going to send Leopard tanks to Ukraine. So I was disappointed to hear this, but recently, one of the members of the German parliament, Slevin, she actually answered this question on Democracy Now! About whether or not she believes this is a good idea. So I just want to play this really quick.
This decision, sending battle tanks to Ukraine from Germany and giving the decision that Poland and others can send Leopard 2 German tanks to Ukraine is a historic wrong decision. And it comes only because of the pressure, the heavy pressure of the United States Biden administration, we have to say. Several months ago, Chancellor Scholz in the German parliament, in the Foreign Affairs Committee, said it is a red line. It's a line of escalation, sending battle tanks from Germany to Ukraine. That would cross a red line. But the pressure now was too heavy, too strong from the Biden administration to send Germany in the front line of this war. And it was the pressure of the coalition partners, the Greens and the Liberals. They are actually the neocons in this coalition in Germany. They officially said that they would breach the coalition if these battle tanks, Leopard 2, wouldn't be sent by Chancellor Scholz to Ukraine. And that was the problem. And we are now in a very bad situation, because I think it's a wrong decision, historic wrong decision, because it's against the majority of the population in Germany. According to new polls in the recent days, the majority in Germany is against sending battle tanks to Ukraine. The majority is in favor for more diplomacy, for a negotiated peace in Ukraine. And the other thing is the 31st of January will be the anniversary, the 80th anniversary of the battle in Stalingrad. And every family in Russia lost loved ones in this battle in Stalingrad. And you do not have to be a prophet to know that sending German tanks against Russia in this proxy war of the United States will have a way more mobilization in the Russian society in this war. So that means you have the opposite impact, what you want actually within Russia towards this war. And this is why it is historically so wrong to send battle tanks.
So, Claire, I wanted to get your take on that. How do you feel about Germany sending Leopard tanks to Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, she's so right on so many counts. And I suppose the first things I would say about her is that we've been struck here in the European Parliament by the actual warmongering of the Green Party in Germany. She's totally right. They are the neocons in terms of foreign policy here in the EU, which is quite shocking for people who would think that they are liberal and sort of involved in social change. But they have been one of the key drivers as well. Look, everything she said is totally true. This is a line now that has been crossed. I'm hoping, and I think there are some signs that it might be a step too far. It may be the straw that broke the camel's back, because a majority of people across Europe are in favour for peace, but they've been afraid to articulate it. But on the back of Germany capitulating now and agreeing to take that historic step, setback, whatever, now we see calls coming out of Germany for an alliance of the anti-war movement, for a call for a more diplomatic solution, for a cessation of hostilities, for the refusal to turn. And I think it may finally wake people up that they have to take action on this, that sitting at home and not protesting and putting their government under pressure is a luxury that they can't afford anymore. I mean, it's truly shocking. 27 million Soviet people lost their lives in the war. We had today International Holocaust Day, we were in the chamber commemorating the millions who lost their lives to the Nazis. But actually, there's been a rewriting of history now, where they're trying to write out the role played by the Red Army in defeating Nazism in Germany. And the fact that we've had decades of sort of reduced militarism from Germany because of that wound and that guilt, I suppose, and that now they're back into active engagement in military aggression. And it is coming from what was, and Biden was on the record of it. And I mean, Hillary Clinton said before that the war in Ukraine, she gleefully said when Russia crossed around, that this could be Russia's Afghanistan, like, you know. And when you look at the horror that Afghanistan is in now, and you look at the disruption and the destruction in Ukraine, you kind of say, well, yeah, she's got her wish, but my God, at what cost? Like, does she want to fight Russia? It's ordinary people who are paying for that. So I think a red line has been crossed in Europe on this. I think the Baltic states have been driving, and Poland have been driving, a very aggressive anti-Russian, pro-NATO stance. Germany and France, to a lesser degree, were standing against that a bit. They've caved on this issue, whether it's just... and it's obviously serious, but whether it's just a headline seriousness, like that they break that non-interventionism, but that it'll be a token one, or whether it'll open the floodgates, I'm not sure. the numbers that's been spoken about now of the heavy vehicles and tanks being sent, the numbers are relatively small. But the problem is that once you make the first step and the first betrayal, well, then all the other betrayals become a little bit easier. But I suppose we don't really know. There are worrying indications of some people saying, well, up to this now, we've been arming Ukraine to help them survive, but now we're arming them to win, which is just utterly ludicrous. And I mean, in fairness, there would be some across the US establishment saying that, but ironically, it's some of the former military personnel or active military personnel in the US services who are being the most rational about this conflict and the most realistic. And I think you have some political war hawks here just playing along with NATO propaganda. They don't know what they're messing with, but it's ordinary people's lives that are at the butt of it. It is worrying, but very worrying.
Do you feel we're on the brink of a nuclear war? And Brent asked here, what do you believe will be the aftermath of this situation for the world?
I don't know if we're on I don't dismiss it lightly. You know, this idea, sure, look, there's no way the Russians will ever go nuclear. I mean, that's very, very sort of, I wouldn't go there. I don't think it's the most likely thing. But in the event of a major escalation, if it was the case that Russia felt it was going to suffer serious losses, I wouldn't rule out them going there. But what's deeply worrying is behind the scenes where a global world has been facilitated in terms of division. So you can see now in the whole area of the South China Sea, for example, is being teed up as the next area where Taiwan is being used as a sort of a Ukraine stick in the way in which Ukraine was used to provoke Russia. Taiwan is kind of being used with China. And the people benefiting from this are the military industrial complex, and countries in that region then are lining up with either side. So North Korea lines up with Russia, South Korea is looking, we'll get a few nuclears as well and we'll go in, but we'll line up with the other side. And all of this is very dangerous because military like, you know, as an anti-war activist, we would have stood for disarmament and all that. When you provide arms, they have to get used, and they have to get used somewhere. And people are going to die at the end of it. And that's the story that we're getting into now. So I suppose what the short answer is, I can see the world in some ways breaking down into those camps. But actually, and my hope in the situation, because I'm always hopeful, is that actually the future of humanity rests outside the blocks that we normally talk about. So here in Europe, we get, you know, talked about, you know, what happens in the US, maybe Canada, maybe Australia. So the big white former colonial powers in a European context, it's their new colonialism now, but actually the majority of the world's population doesn't live in the US and Europe. It lives in the global south. It lives in India and Pakistan, all across Africa. They've the Middle East, they've an incredibly well-educated young population, which Europe doesn't have, and it's getting older and older, and it needs those young people. And the resilience and the fact that the world is smaller now because of social media, that actually my hope is that it's those people in the global south who are going to shape the destination, because it's no accident that it's the countries which contain the majority of the world's populations have voted at UN level and all of that not to go along with the US agenda on this. It's not that they support the war or anything, but they're not going to be used as a puppet in this. They support peace, and 77 of the countries supported peace. So that's where we get the hope from. And again, we find it a bit mad that when we go to places, I had the honor of going to Pakistan before Christmas, and we met people there in the airport who kind of said, I love you guys, you're great. Like, my God, like, you know, it just shows how small the world has got, like that we're from little Ireland and people get to hear stuff like that. So yeah, I think the global south is where the future of humanity lies, if you like. It's in the old days, we had the Cold War, but there was a big non-aligned movement as well, a kind of a third way that stayed out of the US and USSR on both sides. You had all of those countries. I think it's a time for a new non-aligned movement, and probably the biggest components of it are actually the ordinary citizens in Europe and in the US who are so disconnected from their political establishment that sadly, you know, nobody in power in Europe or in the US really represents the people on the ground. But the people haven't found a way to empower themselves yet or take hold of that system. And it's very difficult. And I really feel sorry for the US that you have this two-party system that we have in some ways as well, that people think the Democrats were given the charge of, granting salvation to working people. My God, like, I think that illusion is long gone. But it's a little bit like the British Labour Party. It's what was there to build an alternative. It's difficult, but to go back to where we started, like the unions in Britain, out of the struggle around the rail workers' strike, and the fact that the Labour Party, who'd be similar to the Democratic Party, actually in the rail strikes in Britain, by and large, didn't support them either. So the solution of the unions was, well, we're going to stand our own candidates and we're going to take that on. We had something similar like that in Ireland, where we had a campaign of the trade unions to save our water supply, and we had great support at that time from the Detroit people who were fighting to save their water. They used to come over, but some people in the parliament in Ireland, the trade unions in Ireland, or a lot of them, not all of them, the more militant ones, actually most of them probably not, but enough of them to be important, and people in the communities came together to defend our water system, a bit like the Enough is Enough campaign. And I think, people who have a political platform should use it, but they should use it as a vehicle to organise others, because the people in power don't change things. It's ordinary people who change things, and they force the political establishment in a direction. So we should be using our platform to encourage people to do that. And I think people would be willing if a way is pointed before them, and there is a responsibility on the unions in that as well. A lot of the unions in our neck of the woods aren't great either, and people have had to find new ways and new unions, and have had to take existing unions out of the official structures, because the official structures became too much part of the establishment and gagged and bound them. And that's a bit of the problem. You asked, why could we speak? I suppose, I can speak because I'm answerable to nobody except the people who vote for me. And I said, look, I'm going to say what I think. Will I make mistakes? Yeah, of course I will. But you look at, everybody makes mistakes. There's no problem with that. The only problem is if you don't learn from them, or if you try and cover up from them. And unfortunately, I think political parties too often play games. They're just involved in the headlines and position themselves in the media. I generally ignore the media, which is just as well, given the amount of criticism that we're getting for our stance on the war. If I listen to the media, I wouldn't get out of bed in the morning, to be honest with you. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people in politics just live their lives by what the media say. That's not real life at all. And they've lost the hearts and minds of the people they should be representing,
How are people like you and Mick able to win in the UK? I'm curious if the electoral system is similar to the United States, in the sense that most of the politicians here do take corporate money. They have corporate donors, and that's who they answer to when they're elected. We've had a couple of candidates that were grassroots funded that did win, but those races were not won easily. In the UK, how is it that independents are able to win? Because in the US, independents only win like on the local level. There's a few that have made it into Congress, but they usually caucus with the Democratic Party, like Bernie Sanders, for example. But independents in general in this country just do not do well because of the funding. So they don't get the message out to as many people to even know that they're running. But how is it so much different in the UK? Like, we would like to have more independents in Congress in this country, I think.
I mean, it isn't, and now because I'm from Ireland, which is not the UK, but so Ireland, we do have independence. Actually, in the UK, it doesn't really have independence either, for much the same problems that ye have in the States. But Ireland we have a system what's called proportional representation. So when somebody votes for candidates, they vote 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or whatever. So it kind of tends to benefit small parties. It's being analysed as being one of the more democratic methods of voting. So you can express a preference. It's not, I don't only have to pick one person. I order them, and then maybe the constituency would have a number of seats. So the people who get elected are not necessarily the people who get the most number one votes, but they're the people who get the most votes overall when you tally that system. But we need a whole day to explain proportional representation. But in Ireland, I suppose, I mean, I was a county councillor for years. Mick was well known in football circles. Ireland is a smaller country. We were in the Irish Parliament. We were very well known from being that, I suppose. people in Ireland tend to know their politicians. So we funded our own campaigns and we got elected on the basis that people knew us because of the work we did in the Irish Parliament. And then that was enough to get us elected to the European Parliament, which was, it was a big achievement given that there's only 13 people elected from the whole country and we're 2 of them. So, but I can tell you the media establishment and the political establishment have done such a job on us now that it will be a big ask to hold those seats, because they have really been spending the last number of years in annihilating our reputation. And while many people are very grateful for the stance that we're taking in terms of the war and that, certainly the negative campaigning against us has had an impact on some people, you know. If you repeat a lie often enough, people can believe it, you know. So, yeah. So it's just a different system. We're not as in hoc to the corporate donations. There's regulations in place that which cap the type of political expenditure that can be done. You have to be transparent about your funding. So yeah, political parties fundraise, but it probably doesn't cost as much as it would cost there. And there is a system actually whereby the state provides electoral funding. So if you get a certain percentage of the vote, I think it's a quarter of the quota. So if you got the quarter, you have to get elected, you have to achieve a quota. And it depends on the number of seats, the number of candidates. But if you get 1/4 of the quota, you get your election expenses back up to a certain limit, which I think is pretty good. Like, so it means that the state will repay that. Now, it obviously has to be accounted for. It has to be for certain things, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, I think that's a help. So we kind of knew that what amount of money we could spend, we were able to borrow that. And we kind of said, right, even on a bad day, we'll get a quarter, we'll get that back. So yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, very different from what we have here in the US. I have 2 more questions for you, Claire. And this one is a really good one from MJ. Clare Daly, why are you and Mick the only non-war voices in the EU? Great representation from Ireland.
Yeah, and I mean, actually, the Irish media would tell you that we're actually an embarrassment and a disgrace, and we have ashamed our country. That's the message in the Irish media. But actually, as your callers thing is totally, we get that all the time from people all across Europe. We're not the only ones, but I suppose we've been the most vocal. Why is that? Well, I suppose the short answer is that in about 10 of the 27 European countries, less than 30% of people vote. So the people who are in these chambers are very unrepresentative of the electorate. And there's a big gulf between the people and the institutions here. It's a big bubble. It's a corporate, imprisoned by corporate lobbying. But actually the people have little control over it because we've an unelected commission and the council and all the rest. But yeah, the others could do more, but I think most of them are afraid and they're constrained by their political parties. But it has changed a bit. We've noticed from the first motion where there were maybe 13 people against it, in the latter motions between, abstentions and people voting against, it might have gone up to maybe nearer to 100 out of 700. So people are getting a bit more confident and people are asking a bit more questions. So sadly, it's the lived experience of the horror of the war that's making them change their mind. But hopefully there'll be a few people who learn a bit quicker, because we need to bring an end to this slaughter for sure.
100% agree. My final question for you, Claire, is about Julian Assange. So in October, there was a rally here in the US. There was a rally in DC to free Julian Assange. About 200 people showed up. I was one of the people there. But at the same time, there was also a rally in the UK where like 5,000 people surrounded the parliament holding hands to free Julian Assange. I want to get your take on his particular situation. What we fear here in the US is that if Julian Assange is brought to the United States, it will not end well for him. So we want to prevent that from happening. We want the UK to free him, to let him go. What do you think are the chances of that happening? I have noticed that more mainstream media outlets now are finally saying that Julian Assange should be freed. The same ones that smeared him, by the way, a couple of years ago. But what's the likelihood of that happening? And what do you feel is the danger if someone like Julian Assange is not free for independent media?
Well, I think there's 2 things. I mean, I think if Julian ends up going to the States, he'll probably die there. His health is poor anyway. He's already been incarcerated for years. If he doesn't go there and he's kept in the limbo he's in a high security maximum prison, Belmarsh in the UK, in bad conditions. And the longer the appeals and the legal process goes in, well, sure, he's in hell anyway. Obviously goes to the US, it'll be a greater hell, probably for longer. But so for him personally, it's a big blow. But to be honest, the chilling effect has already been in place. So as far as we've been concerned, this is the greatest press freedom case of our generation. It's the attempt to silence and probably kill, and there were attempts, we know, of course, to actually kill him, the person who exposed US war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan, because that's what he's been accused of. So what other journalist then is going to shine a light on, you know, war crimes anywhere else if that's the way you end up? So it's a huge case for press freedom, and you're totally right. Most of the media who are coming on board now were the ones who were kind of against him in the first place and didn't stand by him, even though they all benefited from his work in the early years. But in terms of the prognosis, I think it's interesting that the new Australian government has been much more vocal on his case now and bringing him home to Australia and using its leverage maybe with both the UK and the US. I mean, the UK could refuse to exercise the extradition warrant and, you know, pull back. But actually, it's Biden really who can refuse to carry on with the prosecution and drop that to begin with, you know. So that's really where it is as well. There had been talk before that Trump might drop it. Behind the scenes, there seems to be some talk about a deal being done. But you'd have to look at the nature of that, because, you know, if there's circumstances where he'd have to plead guilty or whatever, or be incarcerated in Australia, I don't think that's great either. Do you know what I mean? But anyway, let's wait and see. I think your point is back to activism. Nobody can let this go. It is the biggest case. We can't assume that any of these countries are going to save him. They're not. And the only reason they'll change their mind is when they're forced to change their mind. And that'll be by organised people power. But it's changing a bit. Like, we had got a huge number of European Parliament politicians. He was shortlisted for a major prize, a Sakharov Prize for Freedom. It was won by the people of Ukraine here, but Julian was shortlisted and his wife came over. That was a big breakthrough actually in the European Parliament mainstream, because it went mainstream as a key freedom case. So we need to keep building on that.
Well said. Well, Clare, I just want to again commend you for your voice. I really do wish we had leftists like you in the United States in our Congress that were willing to be vocal and push back against these establishment narratives. But all I want to say is, like, thank you so much for coming on and keep doing the good work.
Pleasure is all mine, Sabrina. Thanks very much for having me. Take it easy.
Thank you so much.
See ya.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
All right, guys. I'm going to go ahead and go through these super chats here, shout out patrons, and then I'll go ahead and head on out. I do want to let you guys know, while I have a lot of you here, at 3 p.m. today, there will be an interview with Marianne Williamson at Revolutionary Blackout Network. So some of us are going to be a part of that interview. So definitely check that out. That's 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time today. And then tomorrow, Glenn Greenwald will be here at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So definitely come check me for that. And then I'll be live again later on this evening for regular news. So a lot going on today and tomorrow. So definitely stay tuned for those events. Thank you so much for the super chat, Bryant. Please ask Clare what she believes the aftermath. Oh, yeah, I did ask that question. The aftermath of the situation will be for the world. Thank you for the super chat, Debo. Thank you, Sabby. Thank you. All right, Anastasia, thank you so much for the super chat. Clare Daly is fearless and unapologetic. Imagine if the USA had only one politician in DC that had half her courage. I agree. Thank you for the super chat, Marquis. No one like Clare could make it to the US Congress, Marquis. What's up, Oz? Shout out for the super chat here. Clare Daly is an inspiration to sane Americans. Thank you so much for your wisdom and commitment to truth. Thank you for the super chat, Steph. Thank you, Sabby, and thank you, Clare, for standing up and speaking out. Thank you for the super chat, Susie. Nothing makes me prouder of my Irish heritage than hearing Clare Daly speak the truth. Thank you, Sabby. I love you both. Thank you. Thank you for the super chat, Zimborska. How ethnic minorities in Europe support a Ukraine government which is banning minority languages and religions. Wouldn't Ukraine's policies cause similar civil wars in Ireland, Spain, Belgium, etc.? That's an interesting point there. That's a good question. Thank you for the super chat podcast by George. What does Claire make of Bono's very public position of Ukraine? Oh, sorry, I just saw this. I didn't get a chance to get to all of them, but that's a good question as well. And thank you for the super chat, summer of 1970. Thanks, Sabby. And I'll take that comment on Rockfin, Eric, as well. Thank you so much for the tip on Rockfin, JVB. Can't wait for this one. Thank you. Thank you so much. Kudos. Quick shout out to everyone who is a Sabby patron. I really do appreciate your support, guys. Thank you so much. You're doing the thing over here. You're keeping the lights on. Shout out to everyone who's a Sabby patron. If you're interested in being a patron, I have 5 categories: members, Sabbies, Sabsters, Sabinators, and of course, the ultimate. You can also see their names scrolling across the bottom of the screen. So if you're new here and you're wondering who are all those people scrolling across the bottom of the screen, those are patrons. Thank you guys so much. Really do appreciate that. Just want to make sure I get through all of them here. And shout out to a new Sabby patron, Lydia Maniatis. Thank you so much for that. Really do appreciate that. We call them newbies over here. If you're new, don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to like and share this stream, guys. I think that Claire had very interesting points, and I think more people need to hear this conversation. Not so much for me per se, but to hear what Claire had to say. I think that's very important. And I agree. I would love to have someone like Claire in Congress here in the United States, someone who's willing to push back, who's not afraid, and is willing to really fight. Like, that's all I'm asking for. It's like, I just want someone who's going to fight. Barbara says we need to clone Claire and bring her to the U.S. Thanks, Sabby. I agree. I agree. Guys, if you haven't had a chance to do so, I highly recommend that you check out this interview. I shared this clip earlier with Claire. Check out this interview on Democracy Now! This is new. Again, 7 here was the guest. She is a member of the German parliament. And this is in reference to Germany announcing that they are sending Leopard tanks to Ukraine. The name of this interview is called Germany and U.S. Agree on Tanks for Ukraine. German MP accuses U.S. of pushing Berlin into a proxy war. So check that out. I've heard some really good things about 7 as well. So she's also a leftist over there. So check that out if you get a chance to do so. But other than that, guys, I am going to head out. Thank you so much, Linda, and welcome. Thanks so much. I am going to head out again. Glenn Greenwald will be here tomorrow, 12:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I'll be back live tonight. I got 3 stories to cover. We're going to talk about the Wall Street layoffs, which is freaking huge. I'm going to cover that tonight. I'm also discussing Joe Biden's plan for Medicare. We need to talk about that. And then I believe the other story is the policing story that was discussed on The Hills Rising between Bree and Olami and Robbie. That situation that happened with the gentleman who was tased by the police and died as a result. So check me out tonight, 3 p.m. today, Eastern Standard Time. Go over to Revolutionary Blackout Network. We will be interviewing Marianne Williamson. She has announced that she has an exploratory committee for president. So we're going to have some questions for her there. Other than that, guys, thank you so much for tuning in. I know it's a different time, and some of you on the West Coast may be just waking up. But thank you guys so much. You know how we do this. Have a good night. Keep up the fight.